Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to give you a warm welcome to our session titled Financing the Leapfrogging of Emerging Economies, the Role of Public-Private Partnerships. It's really a pleasure to have this diverse panel, but before we jump into presenting each of them to you, just a short introduction to our session. I think we're all aware that climate change is challenging our status quo. We see all around in our countries and regions how the frequency of extreme weather events is increasing. And also, it has already been calculated, but we all experience it in our economies, that water scarcity is already costing and regions up to 6% of their gross domestic product. And floods, they are forcing and could force hundreds of millions of people from their homes by 2050. And at the same time, and I think that's a key focus of our work in WAPPP, we are facing a 15 trillion infrastructure finance gap. Now, that was all happening already before COVID, and the last 2 years, I think we were reminded that we need a shift in our economic development models. Otherwise, maybe even our life on planet is not viable anymore. So how do we deal with all these key interlocking challenges, with all these multiple crises, infrastructure gaps, climate change, health and biodiversity crisis, in a context of diminishing public resources? The time is running, and as now we are investing to, let's say, stimulate our economies, right? And to go back to the growth levels we were. How do we do that in a way that do not lock us into the present, into the old patterns that were not sustainable, but enable us to leapfrog to a regenerative economy? So this is what we're here today, because while the answer seems quite simple, the implementation is not. The Global Commission on Adaptation already in 2019 called us for 3 revolutions: one in understanding, one in planning, and one in finance. And those are, in a way, what we will be discussing today. How our governments and business leaders, public, private sector, civil society, working together to rethink our investment origination and project preparation process. How can we rethink those to make sure that our investments are bringing us forward and not backward, right? And how do we join forces also to make that possible at a faster pace, because we're running out of time. So it is a pleasure for me today to welcome you all to our second annual WAPPP Congress, but also to introduce each of these 5 pioneers that are coming from different regions of the world, from different perspectives and roles, and will share with us what they are doing about this challenge. So I would like to, one moment, I will present each of them to you before I give them the word, because I think it's good that you know which perspective each of them is bringing. And so we have, first we will have sharing with us Sassini Mojapelo, which is a managing partner and chairperson of Shift Impact Africa and the Share Value Africa Initiative, and a member of the Share Value Africa Initiative Steering Committee. Until recently, Sassini was responsible for group corporate citizenship and community investment at ABSA Bank Group Limited Africa, and her expertise lies in the development and execution of strategic plans linked to business development, focus on the small enterprise development, creating share value, sustainability, and financial inclusion. She's a Harvard Business School graduate and a strategy and development specialist. Welcome, Sassini. I will now move to another part of the world and introduce to you Melissa Sanoko. She's the head of programs at the UK Infrastructure Client Group and works with the most progressive infrastructure clients, industry leaders, government representatives, and the wider built environment ecosystem in the United Kingdom, and increasingly internationally to bring about industry transformation. You will hear much more about infrastructure client groups. I'll tell you that much about that. But Melissa, it's important that you know that she has been really a driving force behind the UK, our vision for the built environment adopted, I think, a couple of years ago or into 2020, which describe a built environment whose explicit purpose is to enable people and nature to flourish together for future generations. She's a member of the World Economic Forum, Infrastructure 4.0, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Deep Decarbonization Initiative, and the UK Construction Leadership Council Task Force, but is also a co-chair of both the Project 13 Adopter Community and the Digital Twin Hub Community Council. Now we're going to another part of the world, or let's say another continent, to the Americas, and I would like to introduce you also to another female speaker. I'm proud that we have a very good balance, or maybe slightly an unbalance today, and that is Genevieve Evans. She's the Director of Impact and Environmental, Social and Governance at Water Equity. Water Equity, you will hear more about, but is the first asset manager exclusively focused on solving one of the most urgent issues of our time, the global water and sanitation crisis. And at Water Equity, Genevieve leads on impact management strategies, policies, and tools, and is involved at all stages of the investment process. She has brought to Water Equity 15 years of experience in impact management and research to her role. And her previous experience includes leading research at the Aspen Institute on Global Entrepreneurship and supporting a social enterprise in the coffee industry in East Africa and Latin America. Now we're moving far. Actually, technically, you're both based in Washington, but Gianleo, from his work, is also looking at the southern part also of Latin America. So it's also a pleasure to welcome you, Gianleo, Senior Climate Change Specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. Gianleo is a climate change economist at the IDB, and there he focuses on climate finance solutions and sustainable investments. He works on financial instruments for the public sector, such as sovereign green bonds, sustainable and resilient PPPs, and the integration of climate change considerations in financial regulation and supervision. Before joining IDB, he was a senior analyst at the Climate Policy Initiative, working on risk mitigation and blended finance instruments for low carbon investments. Before focusing on climate finance issues, Gianleo was a portfolio manager of investment programs dedicated to hedge funds and alternative assets, and his PhD on science and management of climate change is from Foscari University of Venice. Now, and last but certainly not least, we are going to another region of the world, but also to somebody who can tell us also about even other ways of financing, Mohamed Al-Sayed, which is the head of the Public-Private Partnership Division at the Islamic Development Bank. As a manager of the PPP division at ISDB, he is responsible for the development, structuring, and delivery of the bank PPP portfolio across all 57 member countries. And prior to this role, he was the manager of the Economic Infrastructure Division, leading the development of the bank policies and strategies for energy, transport, and ICT intervention in member countries. He has more than 20 years' experience in designing, implementing, and financing infrastructure projects in public and private sector, and has occupied multiple positions at ISDB, including the manager of energy and ICT division, and responsible for sovereign project financing and implementation. His career has been focused on delivering integrated solutions and improving infrastructure projects efficiency. He's also a member of multiple working groups like the UN Technical Advisory Group on SDG 7 and the Sustainable Mobility for All Steering Committee. Well, it's really, I hope you that are joining us today see that this promised to be a quite interesting discussion with all this perspective. And although normally I'm the chair of the Water and Natural Infrastructure chapter, after many years in that sector, I think the only way we can solve this is really working with all other sectors to integrate the true value of water on all these decisions. And that's why I'm very happy that you all joined this discussion today to look at this problem in this way. So I would like to start, after you know all who is here, I would actually like to start asking Sassini Mojapelo to start, because who better than you, working at the intersection between the private sector who wants to solve societal problems in the African continent that is kind of facing major challenge, but also having a major potential for leapfrogging, to start with. Please, Sassini, come and share with us what you're doing around this challenge.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Monica, and afternoon to everyone. I would like to share my screen, so if you could remove yours, I put in mine. Awesome. Let me see. There we go. Right. Let me start off by introducing the Shared Value Africa Initiative. We're a member-based organization. As you can see on the screen there, we've got quite a number of companies, corporates, multinationals, academia, state-owned enterprises that are members of the Shared Value Africa Initiative and Shift Impact Africa. Generally, what we do as a company, we provide, we work with purpose-led organizations that are looking at creating an impact in their line of business. And this is particularly looking at whether it's sustainability, but more importantly, how they create shared value, win-win solutions between their core business and societal impact. And basically, these are some of the members that we have, and our focus as a company is primarily on the African continent. In line with our conversation today, took a step back to look at what are the challenges we're facing on the continent. And I will definitely obviously speak to the African continent, and some of the things, what I will share today is in line with some of the stats that you all know. And I paint a picture of some of the challenges that we see here. And according to the African Development Bank, there's approximately 180 billion on the continent that is required per annum to support the efforts to mitigate climate change and ensure a just energy transition. But also beyond that, there is a general huge gap in terms of financing for the continent in social infrastructure and other areas such as education, access to water, health, etc. And the need to be able to close this gap is obviously enhanced collaboration that is required between public, philanthropic, and private sector investors. If you look beyond that, and I think quite important is the acknowledgement that we are nowhere near meeting these funding requirements. There is limited public, private, and also philanthropic climate finance, which frankly underscores the need to catalyze and leverage the much needed investment flows in global and country financial systems to meet the demand. We can all agree that the need for financing a just energy transition is massive and is urgent. Enhanced collaboration is key between public, philanthropic, and private sector investors to rally behind climate action. In Africa, more so, the opportunity exists for governments to educate their people to leapfrog into green power technology. To do this, all actors need to overcome the trust barriers to engaging the private-public partnerships, which can unlock the financing required to develop renewable energy infrastructure, for example. At the Shared Value Africa Initiative, we strongly believe that the opportunity lies in the ability to drive blended finance solutions. And I'm sure my colleagues speaking today will touch on this and have been working within this space. But we need more platforms within and across countries that can support effective collaboration on delivering blended finance structures that can rapidly scale investment in just climate action and clean energy transformation, social infrastructure development, water access, access to education, particularly in our continent, and access to health infrastructure, which was made quite apparent with the COVID-19 pandemic, where most of the people on the continent could not access tests, but also could not access the vaccine. There is much needed financing, blended finance solutions, as you can see from the slide, to tackle the global, the sustainable development goals, but more importantly, for collaboration between public and private, commercial and development, and government to rally behind this agenda. As you can see from this slide, the ability to deal with the infrastructure gap and other financing needs, such as climate finance, is to bring blended finance solutions. This slide from the OECD does illustrate how blended finance solutions can be scaled by using development finance, either public or private, to attract commercial funding. The role of the public sector, as in government, can be one of ensuring the right policies are in place to attract the right investments into the country. My next slide just gives an illustration of how more investors representing historical levels of capital are looking for investable projects with no return or very minimal return. Our focus needs to look at how we connect financing with a good pipeline of investable projects. In this slide, I present the importance of how different financing and the different investments that have happened on the continent. You will see on this slide that the biggest sector or biggest country that has received financing from the World Bank, DBSA, and other lenders has been in South Africa. This, of course, will require enhanced support for early project preparation stages, portfolio aggregation, and pipeline development curation. The last slide, this particular slide, is a result of a survey that was done by Baker McKinsey of the development finance flows in Africa. I state here that a strong country-level enabling environment by government is vital to support scaled investment projects. For example, in South Africa, the building of Gautrain and the different stadiums, windmill and solar farms that we see cropping up on the continent. This, of course, can only be successful if there are strong public-private partnerships that come together and look at how we can finance the different social infrastructure and needs that are required on the continent. This, of course, will require that government level support will be enhanced to align policies from national scale commitments and development projects down to procurement and regulatory requirements. If looking at this slide, one can see how with the little that has flowed into the African continent, a lot more is required for us having these conversations, but stronger public-private partnerships are required. Our ability to leapfrog on this continent, from example, if we're looking at the energy requirements, is to move beyond the use of fossil fuels and leapfrog into green energy. And that, of course, will require financing to support these kind of innovations that can come, that can support the growth of the African economy. I will stop there and hand over back to Monica.
Thank you, Sasini, for your insightful presentation, but also inspiring words. I think, there were like 3 words that stay with me, and one is how do we need enhanced collaboration, public, private, and philanthropics. In terms of blended finance, also the platforms that would make that blended finance more accessible for the problems that you have, for example, on social infrastructure and the water crisis, and the creation of a strong enabling environment where procurement is key. So I think now I'm very happy that our next speaker is Melissa, because ever since the Infrastructure 4.0 publication of the World Economic Forum, I've been following what is happening in UK, and I think you have made great advances precisely on some of these topics, collaboration, platforms, and the role of procurement. So please share with us, how far you are in here and some of your lessons learned. Thank you, Melissa.
Yes, and I hope that you can all hear me and everything's working. You can see everything, so shout if not. And I just wanted to say, sort of repeat what everyone's been saying about, how pleased I am to be in this particular session, part of this discussion, because it's such an important issue. So thank you for inviting me along. And I suppose what I want to suggest is that one of the key levers for leapfrogging to a regenerative economy is actually getting all the stakeholders focused and aligned around outcomes. So rather than investing in infrastructure, we should actually be investing in better outcomes for people and nature. So what do I actually mean by that? So as Monica's mentioned, in the UK during COVID, the UK built environment got together for the first time, as far as I'm aware, because I mean here including investors and insurers and lawyers. So I'm not just talking about the infrastructure and the construction stakeholders. So the entire built environment got together to create this vision you can see on the screen for the built environment. And the purpose being to create an end destination for all of our initiatives. And that can be across the whole world. That's not just in the UK. So that we're basically all moving in the same direction and to agree on the underlying principles of that vision. So you can see the vision on the slide, and it's for a built environment whose explicit purpose is to enable people and nature to flourish together for generations. And it is only when we shift our focus from creating the built environment to the outcomes that are enabled by it that we can thrive together. And the built and the natural environments are both complex and interconnected systems that are essential for our well-being. So improving the outcomes depends on the services that come from those systems, and also on coordinating the built environment as a whole, not just as the individual parts. And you can sort of see on the right as well that the development of the built environment must take place within a context where the outcomes are aligned from top to bottom. So from the global and the national strategic priorities, so for example, like net zero by 2050 in the UK, through the local requirements to the investment decisions for individual interventions at the bottom. Just slide. And the vision actually ends with enablers, because for the first time in our history, we do actually have the tools and the technology to work together to make the vision a reality. And those, again, are the same anywhere in the world. And a lot of them, don't cost money. So the first one is greater integration. So whether that's between people, organizations, places, processes, systems, or technology. And later, I'm very briefly going to talk about Project 13, which you can see in the top right-hand corner of the screen. The second is about applying the fourth industrial revolution to infrastructure, and that includes utilising connected digital twins. And then digital transformation, and that one's about ensuring that the right people have the right information at the right time to make better decisions, and that leads to the better outcomes I'm talking about. And secondly, it's about improving processes. So it's not just taking our current processes and then digitizing them as they are. And then that's another lever that can be used to leapfrog. So you're actually using digital transformation to optimize, not just to digitize what you already have. And then finally, and in that order, it's about applying technology wisely, but with the purpose in mind. Next one. So we're very lucky in the UK, as Monica said, so our vision has already been translated into policy, and it's been translated into transforming infrastructure performance roadmap to 2030. And it's also actually referenced in Infrastructure Australia's equivalent, which is called Delivering Outcomes. And this is what's called the built environment model from TIP. And you'll see that it includes on the right that mantra that I said about optimizing what's already there, then consider modifying, and then only construct something if it's required, and then build smart and as an intervention on the overall system. And that obviously also reduces cost and carbon automatically. And the decisions, as you can see in the centre, should be based on data coming from the performance of our infrastructure, with the overall purpose of achieving the better outcomes in what you can see at the UN Sustainable Development Goals at the top. And this slide shows three of the main stakeholders that are working, and I stress this, on a voluntary basis. So it's something, again, that can be done anywhere, is to transform the industry and to make the vision a reality. So what you've got on the top is the Government Construction Board, and that's leading the change programme across the government departments. And then on the right, you've got the Construction Leadership Council, and that brings together the leading bodies from across the construction industry. And it's split into the 4 sections, which I know is quite small. I don't know if you can see those 4 sections there in the horizontals. And then there's the key crossing themes in the verticals. And then on the left, and that's me, that's the Infrastructure Client Group. And that brings together the leading economic infrastructure clients in the UK. And it basically acts as a homework sharing club. But it's at board level in the 5 areas you can see in the programme on the left. So that includes digital transformation, carbon, and Project 13. So this slide's also demonstrating how the themes of all the 3 stakeholders align. So what it feels like is that for the first time, we have all the stakeholders at all levels aligned around the same vision, focusing and agreed on the same things, and now actually moving into the implementation phase. And importantly, working together to accelerate the built environment. And I just very briefly was just going to tell you about Project 13, because that is a new way of delivering infrastructure using an enterprise delivery model where all the stakeholders are aligned and incentivized around achieving better outcomes for people and place. And like the vision, it remains at principle level so that it is applicable anywhere around the world. And it has actually been picked up by the World Economic Forum as a flagship initiative. And the principles are based on existing best practice from across the industry that have been pulled together in one model. So it's not just a future theory or hypothesis. It is actually based on real life examples. And we do have adopters putting them into practice in the UK and in other countries, like I've mentioned, like in Australia. And Project 13 creates that alignment around the owner and the customers and all parts of the enterprise around the outcomes. So outcomes are the starting point for engagement. And the capable owner articulates that outcome and brings together the capability required to achieve it in an integrator who works with the supplier ecosystem to find the solution. So this requires a shift in mindset from the investors as well as the rest of the supplier ecosystem. But by moving from this transactional approach to a more integrated collaborative model, it helps to build these more sustainable and progressive future for the construction industry. And it's all focused on achieving better outcomes for people and nature. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Monica.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you very much. I think it was great to see how, if I can take 2 messages from your presentation, which was very inspiring, is that basically it's all about gathering everyone to have be mission driven in the spendings that they will do and in shaping those investments. And that's where the different platforms you show for collaboration are key, right? And the vision for the built environment. But also I think it's quite interesting and inspiring how then, although it's great at that big level, how do you go towards implementation and also create project delivery models that align those incentives so that everyone is really looking for outcomes, not just for immediate outputs or let's say how many assets we built. So that's really great. And with that, and we have now looked at the collaboration and platforms, but it's also a pleasure for me now to go to the next speaker, Genevieve Evans. It's really, I think if you're not coming from the water sector, maybe not everyone here is coming from the water sector, but I have spent the last 12 years in the water sector, and the work that the people behind water equity, the engineer Gary White and the actor Matt Damon have been showing how the people living in poverty are actually creditworthy and willing to pay for access for water and sanitation. So it's a real pleasure to have you then sharing with us, Genevieve, how is that taking place, how this collaboration also that Sassini talked about with philanthropy, but going beyond philanthropy into challenging and also rethinking the financing element is taking place. The word to you now.
Thank you, Monica. So just shout out if you can't hear me or if my slides are not working for you. I'm just going to give a bit of a background on water equity and what we're doing. It's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I think it's exciting that we're here at the table with all these other distinguished speakers. I think it shows that impact investors really can play a role in advancing some of these ideas. So water equity, as Monica mentioned, is we're a spinoff of the nonprofit called water.org. And water.org was founded over 2 decades ago and is really focused on access to water and sanitation at the household level. So helping low-income communities access the financing they need to do things like build a toilet or to connect to an existing network. And they saw that one of the big gaps in that model was that the financial institutions that they were working with were not able to access dedicated lines of credit to fund that portfolio. So Water Equity emerged from that need. We are a separate organization. We're an asset manager. So we raise capital from investors, and then we invest that in emerging markets exclusively for water and sanitation. And Melissa's presentation with this focus on outcomes, I think, really resonates for us because we are entirely outcome driven. And that outcome is really universal access to water and sanitation, and improving people's quality of life through that access. And so as Water Equity, we invest in those financial institutions that are providing that household self-supply, but we're also thinking bigger picture. We saw that as we were entering the space as investors, there's a much bigger gap in financing at the infrastructure level, and water and sanitation infrastructure has been chronically underfunded. So we know that we are not on track to achieve SDG 6. There remain billions of people who don't have access to safe water and safe sanitation. Water stress is increasing, and water quality continues to deteriorate. These are all interlocking issues that are actually worsening with climate change. So as climate change is increasing the intensity of storms, increasing the probability of drought, and with sea level rise, all of these issues will intensify and worsen. So we anticipate that without really additional investment, access will continue to actually move backwards instead of forwards. And so for Water Equity, we see that this is actually an opportunity for the private sector to come in and help fill that gap. Some of the stats on the slide might be too small to read, but the World Bank was estimating that it would take 114 billion in additional cost to achieve universal access by 2030, but that didn't account for operation and maintenance, and it didn't account for the additional costs that climate change would bring to the sector. So this is a massive gap in investment. We know that development finance alone is not going to fill that gap. There is one study that was done that showed there was $1 trillion needed annually from the private sector to fill the gap from public investment and development finance. And so as an investor, what we see is there is this, alongside this need and these global crises, there is this increasing awareness from the public and from other institutions that something needs to be done about that. And part of that is making sure your money is being put to good use, not just to earn a return for yourself, but to actually generate the outcomes that we need as a global society. I think that there is increasing evidence that institutional investors recognize that these are systemic risks, that climate change affects not just people's quality of life, but it will have an underlying effect on their financial results. So we need to address not just mitigation, but also adaptation now. So there's increasing money from institutional investors. And at the same time, individuals really want to make sure their money is doing good. So we're seeing increasing interest from just retail investors in finding impact-oriented or values-driven opportunities for them to invest. So Water Equity can come in and provide an opportunity for this type of investor to channel their investment into water and sanitation. And we do that not alone. An investor has a pretty specific role to play. We do our best to identify the projects that will generate the outcomes that we're looking for and reduce risk as much as possible. So I'm the director of impact and ESG at Water Equity. When we look at deals, we're trying to assess how much positive change will happen and can we mitigate any ESG risks that might be alongside that. So part of that is through stakeholder feedback, as has already been mentioned, and understanding what's the climate risk of a particular investment. But at the same time, an investor cannot make all this change alone. It really takes a collaborative approach. So we partner with water.org. who comes in and focuses on policy and advocacy, and also on the project development support. And then water equity can come in and provide that investment capital. And it's really that partnership that I think has the most potential to make the biggest difference. I think coming in with the water sector in particular and expecting to find deals that are investment ready for private investors is quite challenging. And we would be investing in the same projects that are already having no trouble accessing financing. But that's not what's needed. What we needed is that blended approach where we can actually come in and support project development, structuring so that the deal is ready to take on private investors. And then we can come in and channel our funds where they're needed most. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to Monica. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Genevieve, for sharing. I think it was great and hopeful to hear from you that there are more and more institutional investors, but also individuals, and companies who wants to put the money to good use, and that you can work through that blended finance approach to create that bridge, and that channel to get that money to good use. It was also great to hear how you have kind of going to take also that more systemic view as Melissa was also looking at, right? How do we get those outcomes? You need to look at all the subsystems and the infrastructures in place and so forth. So, but also at the financial resilience of this community. So this has been great to hear. And with that, actually, I would like to go to Jan Leo. I didn't say anything about myself, but I'm born in Nicaragua, so I grew up hearing about what the Inter-American Development Bank was doing at the beginning, more on education. But the last years also following what has been done by the water practice, but also the infrastructure practice. So it's an honor, Jan Leo, to have you sharing with us how you're making possible that money flows into the region for the right cause. Please, Jan Leo, share. Yeah, yours.
I'm gonna try sharing the screen. So, do you see? This always happens. Do you see the notes or the full presentation?
Oh, we don't see. No, now we see how it should.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Gianni Frisari from the IDB. I work in, as Monica said in the introduction, on the sustainable finance side. And particularly, I kind of cross two practices, the green finance practice, where we work a lot with governments and public sector banks and financial institutions, and the PPP unit, that is, let's say, a facility within the IDB to put together the various stakeholders that are involved in the PPP cycle. And I'm gonna take just 2 words on the IDB. We are the largest development lender in the region, multinational organization committed to the region. I work in the public sector side, but we also have a private sector arms, IDB Invest, that also has been participating in the Congress, so you might have heard from our colleagues on that side. We at the IDB, as said, we work on the PPP infrastructure cycle, and I'm gonna focus today on the financing side. That is the activities in which we identify, let's say, the climate potential, or we support, let's say, PPP units and stakeholders to identify the potential for climate-related objectives in projects. We support the analysis and the structuring of funding and sustainable finance mechanism. We support the access to financial instruments, and then the monitoring of climate impact factors. This is, let's say, it's our toolkit for sustainable PPPs. We started on climate resiliency with the work in Jamaica that you can see on the top right. We've now been expanding this into, let's say, a full-fledged sustainable assessment that includes not only climate, but also social sustainability, financial sustainability, and institutional sustainability. So why this is important, and this is great to follow Genevieve's presentation, because it's important because the market for sustainable investments have been growing. I mean, Genevieve showed international charts. These are charts for specific to Latin America on the liquid side of the market, let's say the sustainable bonds. And you can see the same, let's say, a luckier or like a more optimistic hockey stick for those involved in climate and know and are used to the now infamous CO2 concentration charts. We can see here that the market has been growing in the region. More importantly than just the growth, I think it's important to note how the market is changing from being focused on niche green issues to a more heterogeneous sustainable market that looks at sustainable bonds, at social bonds, and now also the sustainability linked bonds. And especially the expansion towards more social and sustainable, it's interesting for the PPP space because many times it's quite hard to have pure green infrastructure, pure climate-oriented infrastructure, but it's actually more easy to find social-oriented infrastructure. Also on the issuer side, there are interesting notes for PPP, for the PPP world as well, because more growth in the sustainable finance market in the last few years has been coming from sovereign issuers and corporate issuers. And these are respect to the beginning where it was mostly development finance institutions or large financial institutions. So these are like developments in the market that bode quite well for the expansion, let's say, or for the use from PPP projects of sustainable finance market. But what investors want, and I think Genevieve mentioned a few characteristics. I mean, we all know, and research has highlighted several times the need to produce for investors de-risked vehicles, liquid and institutional scale vehicles. We've been seeing also the importance to work on formats investors are familiar with, and this is where the bond format works well. But also, especially when we say when we speak about sustainability, investors do really want reputable, verifiable, sustainable characteristic of the structures. And this is where let's say the structuring of sustainable securities might come handy. At the ADB, we are piloting several structures, and these are like preliminary charts from a work that we will be publishing most probably towards the end of the year or next year. But this we've been like mapping and advising PPP units on how to attract institutional capital. This, with the use of the blended finance, is probably the most traditional way in which a DFI like IDB, IDB Invest, or our peers in the region and globally attract or channel climate funds, sustainable funds from donors, and lend under a blended finance package to the concessionaire. This is a traditional, let's say, non-sovereign lending form from a development finance institutions. And here is mostly under what MDBs have agreed as blended finance principles. So here the focus would be on the additionality of the concessional capital, the crowding in of the private market, and the sustainability of the structures over time. The biggest limitation to this is that climate funds, concessional capitals is very scarce. So there is, although DFIs have a significant leverage potential, but still we are limited here, let's say, on the ability of low interest bearing capital or grants. What we've been expanding, or we are looking to expand toward the sustainable finance market, is using structures like sustainable bonds. And there are two models we are pursuing. One is working with sovereigns, especially for PPP models that have milestone payments or large availability payments. The idea here is for the government to issue sustainable bonds for the financing of the infrastructure. We've seen the largest sustainable bond issuer in the region, Chile, has been using sustainable bonds to finance the large infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, especially rail, in both Santiago and in the province. The other model is the use of project sustainable bonds, and here is the concessionaire who can issue directly bonds under the sustainable umbrella when the project is financially sustainable, like using user fees. In both structures, there is a significant capacity building efforts and significant structuring efforts in preparing the sustainable framework. So basically identifying the assets and verifying that the assets can be qualified as sustainable under what typically use in the International Capital Market Association taxonomies for green, social, or sustainability, and then producing and supporting the governments and the issuers in producing the outputs indicator and the KPIs that will be needed to monitor the sustainability impact of these structures. Another thing that beside the structuring that we are supporting governments and PPP units in doing to attract more institutional investors is the creation of sustainable pipeline. And here is an example from Mexico. The platform is online. It's called Proyecto Mexico. The platform started with a compilation of all the projects in the country in preparation phase, but also in tendering, so looking for capital. And we've been working with them for several years now to develop a rigorous assessment of the sustainability of each project under the IDB Sustainable Infrastructure Framework that goes together with the projects and is then presented to the investors. Investors can also filter the platform under the sustainable framework, so for the sustainability characteristics of the project, or even for the tag of green project that the platform has. And now, more recently, with the support of the German cooperation, GIZ, the platform has also started to tag projects for their alignment with the SDG. So allowing basically investors to channel their interest in the projects according to the SDG they are more interested in, or more like as Genevieve was saying, for them would be SDG 6 on water. So these are, I wanted just to give like an overview of things we can do, things we are supporting the region to do, to highlight the sustainable finance potential of the PPP pipeline in the region, either through direct structuring or, let's say, more soft support through the construction of pipelines and the tagging of the project for their sustainable characteristics.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you for sharing like the different kind of leverage points you're trying to push, to get the region towards that leapfrogging that is very necessary. Now with these, and I mean, I noted, I think there were three things you presented which are very important: is the technical assistance bit and the toolkits, to enable the structuring of these projects. Then, of course, also all the different innovations, financial innovations that you are putting in place to make this possible. And the last one, this platform, I think is also very important to make a little bit like the metrics and the comparability of projects easier for investors, right? So with these, I would like to give the floor to Mohammed Al-Sayed, who will tell us, actually, I must say that I've been learning more and more lately about the Islamic Development Bank. You hosted during the World Water Forum a session on the water, energy, food nexus. And it was quite inspiring to see how much dynamism, you are, and creativity you're putting there to help your members do this leapfrogging. So it would be great, Mohammed, if you also tell us, you had recently your annual meetings, about the trends you see, and also since you lead the PPP unit, also what's the role of PPP and what role might play in the future. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, Monica. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And thanks to all the colleagues, I think we've addressed very well the downstream activities, but I'll try also to talk a little bit about the upstream activities. Before we jump into it, I think, like you mentioned, IDB, we are a multinational development bank. We have 57 member countries, all the way from Indonesia to Suriname, and all the way from Albania in Europe to Mozambique in the south of Africa. As a multilateral development bank, of course, the socioeconomic development of, our member countries is our top priority. Of course, along with the achievement of the SDGs and in line with the Paris alignment, taking all in consideration, the climate change aspect, the fragility, and the women and youth empowerment. That's all within the aspect of the project that we finance and design and we take into account. Jumping into the PPP itself, and like I said, my colleagues have talked very well about the downstream activities, but I would like to take you one step earlier before we can talk about all these and even about the structuring of the finance, about the blending of finance. It takes a lot of effort, years and millions of dollars to reach to that point. And here I want to talk about the challenges. I mean, obviously, we all talked about the diminishing public financing, and that started before COVID. I mean, we cannot blame it all on COVID. We know that this started before COVID. Part of it, we see that in certain part of Africa, there's a debt ceiling that is near reaching over there. There's more focus on social project. So this issue have actually resulted in an opportunity for PPP to come in. But we all need to remember that there is a P in that PPP, which is the public. So the role of the government is absolutely critical. PPP is not a ticket out for any government. On the contrary, it takes a lot to prepare, the regulatory framework. It takes years to have these, laws in place, and usually a number of iterations that need to be adapted to address the needs and the lessons learned that happen in the first few PPP projects. Capacity building, not only in these PPP, units, it takes also in the line ministries that's going to take over these projects, being whether water, electricity, utilities, all of them. And then we move down to the project level where you really need a well-prepared projects. And that's, again, takes a lot of effort and a lot of, preparation to have a well-prepared project that has the sustainability aspect and has a well-designed, fair design that takes care of the private sector interest and investors and the government and the citizens and the services provided to them. During the award, the transparency. This is where the government gets its attraction from the private sector, where they feel that there is a comfortable framework, there is transparency, there is a law, a law that really support the investor and they feel comfortable jumping in. And finally, the story goes way even beyond the project is awarded and it's working, the honoring of sovereign commitment. Our IMF colleagues, they always remind our government, counterpart that PPP is not a free ticket. The sky is not the limit because government have commitments, whether it's being offtake or backstop guarantees. So all of these has to be taken into account by the government before we jump into a PPP in order to have a successful PPP. You can rush into it, but you cannot guarantee the success and sustainability unless you address all of these. And from IDB side and our other MDB colleagues, we always work on these, advisory services, which is to address part of all of this. Because we know that many of our member countries might not have reached the maturity yet and the experience to go through all of these. And we try to replicate that through a mini program that we call it a South-South cooperation, where we allow developing countries to share their lessons learned with the other developing member countries. So as far as a trend, I think we can see it very well in our member country, a fast tracking of PPP projects. It's very well example seen in Indonesia, Uzbekistan, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Uganda, Senegal. I'm talking about actual projects that's taken place in these countries. We're glad to see a focus on social services. It started before COVID, but now it's really picking up at a much faster rate, and it proved that health projects are important. And yes, we have very successful examples that we financed in IDB. We have a couple of hospitals in Turkey we financed, and many others are coming in Uzbekistan. And I think government have realized it's a very efficient model where you can, tap on the private sector experience to implement a very reliable, resilient model. we're very glad to see the commitment to Paris alignment, through these, NDCs, the national determined contributions. I think now this goes without say in all parts of the world. This is now, the fundamental thing in any financing that we do as an MDB. This is part of our policy. And we're glad to see that happening. One thing to bring, and maybe we'll discuss it more later, when we talk about just the transition, and that's very important, that the needs of certain developing countries might be different than the aspect of developed countries. When we talk about just the transition, we're talking about affordable, being water, electricity, or even transportation. Affordability is a key. Transition, speak about a gradual transition. So again, it is not a switch, and it's not an immediate switch. To member certain developing countries, they can do the immediate switch. Others might not be able to afford it. So just to put that in the context of developing countries, it's important to keep that in mind. And finally, a growing trend in Islamic financing. And I think this is something we see in our member countries. Again, it's been getting traction worldwide. The Islamic financing, it's almost near $3 trillion and growing at a double digits every year. And there is not much of a difference in Islamic financing. A lot of people, when they hear Islamic financing, they kind of, wonder how different it is. It's built on a foundation of being socially responsible investment. It's about, again, very fit with our MDB mandate, being a socioeconomic development of the citizens and taking care of the citizens, and in the content of financial protection for both the lenders and the borrowers. Also, it is based on real economies. So in Islamic financing, there is no lending of money to money. It's always based on assets, and there's always an operation that is being financed. So again, it is not lending of money to money. And that takes us to the main principle that actually differ between conventional financing and Islamic financing, which, by the way, they coexist in almost all the projects that we do. There is a tranche for Islamic financing and tranche for conventional. The two facts that it is, asset backed. So there is always, like I said, the physical and operational asset that is underlying this transaction. And it is not interest based. So there's always actually a transaction of either a sale or leasing, and these are not time variant. And I think many of our beneficiaries had got to appreciate that during COVID, because many who defaulted in a number of payments, we just got to reschedule it for them with no additional cost. And I think really appreciate that. And they got to understand what is the socially responsible part of the fundamental that we promote. So this is in a nutshell the difference in the Islamic financing, and that helped us to develop a number of tools that we work on through different mode of financing, both on sovereign and on PPP. And I think, Jolyon have done a very good job in explaining a number of these, related to the bonds or seeking it from the market. But again, the thing is, PPP, it's a complete story, and it has to start right with the government involvement until we reach all the way to the award. And the beauty of PPP is the sustainability, because you have to live with these projects till the end of it, unlike many of the sovereign project where we see it goes unnoticed, and sustainability is a kind of a question mark. So having said that, back to you, Monica. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. It was really great to hear how in a number of trends in the region, like the focus on social services, because I think that is also where we probably can achieve the outcomes fastest, but also what the concept of Paris alignment is, how is that taking shape, and how you're making sure also that there is this just transition, right? It was also great that you remind us some of the challenges, because that will take us to the next part of the discussion. By the way, you can, there are ways for all the people who are participating to pose some questions. But with these challenges that you mentioned, concerning also basically the installed capacity in the countries to take those steps to make that leapfrog and shape transformational investments, I'd like to open now the discussion part of this section. And Melissa, I would like to know, would you still have time? A couple of minutes?
Yes, yeah, and I'm
Okay.
sorry I have to run off. Please
No,
apologize.
it's no problem. So yeah, a question to you, Melissa, because I mean that procurement part and that capacity to invest on a transformational pipeline is quite key on what you presented to us. What are the success factors for that collaboration at the infrastructure client group, right? And how are these initiatives and platforms financed, no? Or kept it going in any case? Keep going, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So, so the good news is that it's all kind of free. I think you're going to be surprised at what the answer is, because it's it's about people and behaviour. So the success factors, interestingly, are actually about trust. So what really the infrastructure client group is about is creating spaces of trust where people can share and they don't feel threatened or criticised, and that's really important because they can share their mistakes. And there's not really a space where you can do that. So the second one, leading from that, is actually about the understanding that they weren't in competition. So this is only economic infrastructure clients. It might be different, say for housing it might be different, but for economic infrastructure clients, the water sector is not in competition with the transport sector. Transport sector is not in competition with nuclear. Even within transport, Network Rail isn't in competition with Transport for London. And that was a major shift in changing, because then you're more likely to share your mistakes, but you also can share your best practice. So you're not going to be protecting it and scared about that, because you just realise, well, actually, what have we got to lose by sharing that? And then the third one, another really important one, is realizing that you're not unique. So everybody came to the table saying, well, no, the problems that I've got and the things that I'm facing and the things that I'm building, they're all different. And there's not anything possible that I could learn from what you're going to tell me. And so just those three really small things can have massive, and we're probably talking millions, if not billions, because if one has made a mistake and the other doesn't make it because of who these players are, that's massive. And then how are they financed? Well, the good news is it's like, as I described it, as the homework sharing club. This is just the CEOs getting together. This is the chief data officers getting together. It's the chief sustainability officers, whoever's responsible for net zero targets, etc. They just get together. And what I like to say is that I hope they come out of each meeting, whatever meeting it is, and they feel they can do their job better because they've learned something from someone who's doing it and say, well, why can't I go and try and do that in my organisation now? And the important bit is that they're at the right level to be able to do that. So this is all about change management. So they need to be in that level that if it's about, well, we need to change the way we procure, then they can actually go back and do that. So it is at a very sort of strategic high level, but actually the things underpinning it are really simple and they're free.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you very much for sharing some of these lessons learned. With this, actually, I would like also to ask, Sasini, because I think you talk a lot about collaboration and the need to have that public-private philanthropic collaboration. Do you think such a model like the UK model presented by Melissa and pioneered by the ICG might work in your context? Or what would be necessary next steps or changes for it to somehow work?
I think listening to the different speakers, the underlying words are trust, transparency, over and above the collaboration. And if I look at our context, trust and transparency are two big challenges we have on the continent. And trust in government, that the funds received will actually flow to the beneficiaries. A key element mentioned by Melissa, for example, is around being focused on outcomes. So as much as private sector, we can focus on the outcomes. We do need government to create the right enabling regulatory environment for us to be able to operate effectively in driving the different financing structures that are required. And to do so, it obviously has to be a collaborative effort. Whilst different groupings can come together to try and deal with the different challenges that we have on the continent, I do think the major challenge that you'll find still are underpinned by the lack of trust and the lack of transparency that we see in the different countries where we are trying to shift the dial, whether it be a connectivity issue or it be a just transition, as mentioned earlier, taking into consideration the impact on our communities. As much as we look at the requirement that is there, the trust relationship between private sector, public sector is not really there. And I do think that as a result, best practice such as presented by Melissa does present gaps and cracks for us to be able to take it forward.
Thank you, Sassini, for sharing your view on this and what are the challenges ahead. I would like actually now also to ask Gianleo. I mean, I think the 2 points you made, Sassini, on trust and transparency are really key, but maybe so fundamental that we need to give it further thinking how to advance. But Gianleo, what are important bottlenecks that you observe at local level to shape that pipeline so that when you get on that platform are more projects and better projects every time?
Well, probably the most important bottleneck is timing, in a sense that typically, and unfortunately, sustainability has been left as an afterthought too many times. So in the first phases, and this is also why we started working with this toolkit from the very early assessment of projects. Typically, we arrive in projects when let's say the planning institutes or the agencies have been already green-lighted the project, some structuring is being placed. We arrive and we bring a baggage. Sometimes, the sustainability perceived as a baggage that is no longer feasible in terms of redoing the assessment or reopening the design. And this, from the private sector, it's already a problem. When it comes to the private sector, is an insurmountable challenge, because usually the private sector enters when the project is in tender and the RFP and the documents have been completed. So the main bottlenecks is to really start early, looking at not only the risk. We've been working mostly on resiliency, as Mohamed said, because PPPs are like long-term marriages, like they are like 30 years contract. You have to start and to be very clear from the beginning if you want them to stay and thrive. So we started from the issue of risk, but we've seen as well on the climate opportunities, if you don't capture those elements from the beginning, if you don't prepare the designs to enhance the green part, and don't produce those, and don't expect and estimate those impacts, it's also very difficult to structure any financial instruments that actually would be suitable for investors and would have the impact that these, let's say, responsible investors want. So definitely the main bottlenecks is timing, and the main solution is start as early as possible and consider sustainability, not just climate, as an integral part of the project cycle.
Thank you very much, Leo. I would like actually to do a similar question to Mohamed for your member countries. Which bottlenecks do you observe? But also, are there some specific pioneering instruments or facilities that you're implementing or thinking to implement to help the process of leapfrogging?
Thanks, Monica. And I think very similar to as an MDB, as Gianleo said, it's getting the right design from the beginning. It is where the bottleneck, and having the number of ready projects will attract developers who now got sophisticated both in the financing models and in the implication and the implementation of the projects. So I think this is where we're really focusing a lot on the advisory, because now we're realizing it is the key to success of PPP is these advisories, and again preparing both the country atmosphere and background and framework and the projects. And there is a number of facilities that we work in all together as MDBs, like the GIF, the Global Infrastructure Fund, being hosted by the World Bank. There is the MCDF, which is another facility hosted by the AIIB. So this is in terms of preparing these projects and having them ready. Another aspect, we are also, for least developed countries, we focus a lot of concessional financing. While amounts are limited, we try to blend them with the grants as much as possible in order to increase these amount. And we go for these critical infrastructure in these member countries that enable economic growth and that can open the door for other aspects. And even taking in account, again, I keep leaning back to the sovereign and the government, because we try also to promote the government to have these investments, sovereign investment, that will open the door to PPPs. So sometimes investment in infrastructure that will open the door for other PPPs, like the having the reliable electricity, having the reliable water sector, having access to roads. Again, in certain member countries, these are elements to attract private sector to come to these countries to open the door for PPP.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And with these, actually, I would like to also pose a question to Genevieve, because I think you have rightly reminded us, Mohammed, about the role of the public sector. Now I would like to go back also to the investor piece. Could you tell us a bit more about what is considered now an attractive investment, by impact investors, and how also we can bring them into this thinking systemic and outcome and based on or focus on outcomes versus financial returns? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a broad range. Some investors are coming in within a blended finance structure, coming in and offering really patient capital. Maybe they're even offering grants because they see that that is going to catalyze additional financing. But a typical investor has a lot of constraints. Liquidity is a big one. So when we're looking at investing in infrastructure projects where maybe you need to take a 10-year stake, that's quite challenging for the majority of investors. They're also looking for a sort of risk-adjusted return that aligns with the whole of their portfolio. So when they see a specialized investment into a water fund, that can be a challenge for them. They have to identify where that would fit within the rest of their portfolio. So helping them identify a benchmark, I think, is quite important as well. And then the impact is becoming increasingly important. So helping, I think a big piece that would really move the sector forward is creating for adaptation and resilience what already exists for mitigation. And that is a framework that investors can immediately understand, and they have the language to identify a high impact opportunity versus a lower impact opportunity. And I think that's growing, but there's still quite a ways to go. So we saw this big uptick in social bonds, not just climate bonds, which I think is an important step. And there's also this increasing regulation coming from different markets focused on climate, but that also include physical climate risk. In the US, that's on the table. And then in Europe, a bunch of other indicators that would indicate, is this really a green product and a social product, or is it just greenwashing? So I think there's definitely barriers, but with sort of matching investors to opportunities, I think we can find a way to build a stack of capital that can work for the projects that we're talking about.
Thank you, Genevieve. I think it was quite great that you give us also those kind of constraints. I think Mohammed has given us some of the constraints they face to get, PPP in the pipeline, and Janelle too. But yeah, how do we play now with all these different roles, constraints, and interest? And with that, I would like also. There are some questions in the Q&A. We have now some 15 minutes left, and I'll make some of them to you too, but also I would be very much interested, besides what we got presented from the UK, do you see any other types of partnerships and collaboration platforms emerging where we are tackling and achieving this alignment of incentives by different actors? Because we also have, we don't have today here, but we also have multilateral climate funds wanting to play a role in this setting. So there, I leave you with if anybody would like to share about these, how you're also joining forces with others to enhance that local project preparation capacity. In the meantime, I will scan some of these questions from the chat. If anybody wants to volunteer, please just unmute yourself and share with us.
Maybe I can jump in, Monica. We've seen actually good cases where developers, they step into a market, especially if it's a French market, and they take it upon themselves to take bilateral discussions with governments, and they kind of set the model. You know, again, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, it's in a way the advantage of being the first in the market that kind of take a little bit from the transparency and equality of to others. However, sometimes that's a way that the other governments who cannot support, you know, to build that capacity over a long period of time, they view that as a very, you know, good shortcut to at least to start implement a project or two where they set the standard and they see, you know, kind of you know, kind of to have a lesson learned on it and taking the risk on such an approach. So that's one of the approaches that we've seen it happening in some developing countries.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I don't know, Sassini or Genevieve, if any thoughts on these questions?
I can take a stab. I would say, so, you know, as water equity, we're considering all angles at approaching the problem. And I think Mohammed made a really interesting point. That's one of the avenues that we would be exploring. I would say for us, our own experience right now is more narrow, but we have seen a lot in India with exciting models that are bringing in the private sector, especially in wastewater and sanitation, which are traditionally really underserved in terms of financing. So there's, for example, a bunch of fecal sludge treatment plants that were financed or offered through the hybrid annuity model in India, bringing in the private sector, not only to operate the plants, but really to experiment with what this would look like for the first time. Because this is such an area that it has such high need, but where there are very few examples of this functioning correctly. I think that kind of small scale experimentation is really important as a first start, and then moving that out. So seeing how that can spread globally or really scale within India will be exciting to see.
Thank you, Genevieve.
I think on from my perspective and some of the conversations we've had, I'll refer to South Africa. The challenge is mainly around understanding the risk, and I think it's a market that's still in its infancy. So the biggest challenge is how to structure the deals to be able to make sure that there is the right sustainable outcome. If I look at some of the work we did around sustainable financing, and I look at the risks and the credit models that are there, they're still very much a business, a bottom line focused one around how much money they're going to make, not necessarily looking at the outcomes and the impact. Whilst there's a lot of work and thinking around impact investing and sustainable financing, if you look at the actual deals themselves, they're not outcome-based and are not to the benefit in the long term. They're quite focused still on traditional business models and funding models, and they're not risk adjusted. So I think that remains a challenge for us on the continent. In my previous role, overseeing a few countries, for a fact in the banking sector, there was very few focus around sustainable financing and what that meant. There was a lot of green bond issuance, but that is still within the same risk profile. If you look at the green bonds that are issued, it's whether their projects are aligned to green outcomes. But beyond that, from a costing and funding perspective, the models remains the same. So I think the challenge on the continent still remains, and it's still in its infancy, and a lot of work still needs to be done around how to structure blended finance solutions and even looking at impact investing.
Thank you very much, Sassini. By the way, for all our the people listening, our other speaker had a little technical problem. He might be able to join us toward the end. Please, if you have some questions, place them in the Q&A section. There was a question from someone about how blockchain could play a role in the issue of transparency and confidence. Would any of you like to elaborate if you had experience? I don't know, Sassini, have you seen some of those applications of blockchain in the continent that give us some hope or maybe false hopes? So yeah, open to all of you.
Well, I think that's a very difficult question, particularly for my continent. Whilst there is some level of understanding around what blockchain can do, I do not think as a continent we're at the level where we could actually utilize it to that extent. It is still something that is not well understood. And obviously I can see the question, but I'm not sure how it would deal with trust in the context that I understand it, and how government would embrace that. Because to have a strong collaboration, you've got our government, or public sector that is still not as advanced, and most are not digitally enabled to begin with. And then to introduce technology into an environment where it's still predominantly paper-based, but also trying to introduce new terminology into a deal structure or a public-private partnership is not going to be easy, I believe, thinking of my context. But I would be interested to find out how blockchain could actually work in a discussion around public-private partnerships, and more so enhancing trust within that relationship.
Thank you, Cecilia. I think I know who I want to then pass on this question, Mohammed, since you have also been looking at in the past, at energy, ICT, but also just coming from your meeting, with all the members. How does the digital transformation, how is that going to play a role, do you think, in your region, and actually help us maybe on the issue of trust?
Like that, definitely in principle. I mean, one good thing that came out of COVID is how fast the digitization have been happening even in our developing countries. So you can see a lot of truly a leapfrog in so many applications in so many countries. Now, specifically about the question of blockchain, I mean, frankly, I mean, we did not have any specific experience in that. In theory, yes, it definitely will introduce a level of transparency. But I think, Zina's point is exactly right. Is at least in the member countries that we are in, we haven't reached the level that this has become, commercially viable, and to the government, that to the level the government is using it on a daily basis. I think it's for every new technology there is a learning curve that people go through and governments go through. Things nowadays are going at a very fast rate, so I expect it to be a fast one. But none of, at least in our member countries, we haven't reached the level where these can be implemented. But I expect very soon these things will be happening.
Thank you. Genevieve, on this point, is there an area you're looking at?
Yeah, we similarly don't have a focus on blockchain. I'd be interested to see if there are any examples in other sectors beyond water. I would say that digitization is in general, though, is a big point for the water sector. Even in the US, digitization of smaller systems there's a big gap. And it's even bigger in a lot of emerging markets. So focusing on improving the operation through digital solutions, I think, would be a great way to see that leapfrogging happen, because it also can help de-risk a project. If the operations can have some of these digital components to them, smart water in different ways, then that also there's a benefit to your financial return for investors, but there's also a benefit to the overall management of the system and the sustainability of the system, and ultimately to water users. So I definitely see that there's a link between the outcomes that we're looking for and a digital transformation.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. We have some other questions in the chat about PPPs in the urban sector, and if you see there new ways in how these are being structured, especially, of course, in the context of developing countries. It's a little bit more general question, but I don't know, Mohammed, if there is something in which you could you could help us with this question.
All right, apologies, just the audio was going up and down. So I'm just reading the question here. How PP in urban sector could be structured, especially financing in an issue in developing countries. Sure, I mean, we've seen a lot of, water and desalination projects It's becoming very common actually in United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia over here, and the structure is becoming, very standard over here. I mean, as any PPP structure, they establish a special purpose vehicle company where the process of, for example, desalination or water distribution is the function of that company. Of course, that's where the government role and the government offtake comes in, both input and output, where providing the water, taking off the desalinated water, transition. So all these elements really relies on having a strong framework and government backstop around it, both to the physical input and output of the infrastructure itself, and given the financial aspect of it. But in many countries now, this is a very standard PPP structuring in urban development in all aspects. Utilities and water and desalination, all kind of aspects. So this is really very standard.
Thank you very much. I would like actually to give you the floor now, just for sharing with us a couple of finalizing thoughts about this conversation. Is there some new homework you get with you? And at the end, I will give also a little of a very short summary of what we discussed today. So since we have more female today, I'll give you the floor, Mohammed first, then Cecilia and Genevieve, on how would you summarize, or which homework are you taking with you?
Well, thanks for the setup, and I think it's been really great exchange of ideas from different level of the activity. On the financing level, I really urge everyone, no matter which angle they come from, is to keep thinking about the new innovative way of financing. There are many now new financing structures, soft mini perm, multiple tranches, blended financing, equity, increased equity, and green bonds. So really the old way of financing of just basic equity and debt is really no longer there, and every day we're seeing a new structure, new way of doing things. And again, really we have to keep in mind sustainability, because reputation is something that really matter. And as MDBs, we've been in the market for a few decades, and pretty much we're going to be there for a few decades. So we really see those who try to take opportunity of just short-term profits, that they really fade away very, very quickly from the market, because reputation does matter when it comes to infrastructure. It's a long-term investment, and people stay around, and they do remember that. So that's my message to everyone.
Thank you. Sassini, please.
I think for me, the closing remark is around the fact that looking at climate change and the need for a just climate energy transition is one of the main things that have globally brought us together. And the need to look at a net zero target as a country and globally has led to more collaboration required. As private sector, you cannot go it alone. As government, you cannot go it alone. As philanthropy, you cannot go it alone. Civil society cannot. So with that context, our ability to start thinking quickly around how we structure and work together to finance the global challenge we face with climate change is more urgent. And it is important for anyone sitting around the table today to be thinking innovatively around how we leapfrog around the issues of climate action and climate justice, but more also around technology access and changing the narrative around how we are mitigating the climate change that we see across the globe. For me, that I think is the rallying cry for the need to leapfrog around creating the role of a strong role for public-private partnerships.
Thank you, Sassini. Genevieve?
Yeah, I would echo everything everyone has said. Thank you, Sassini, for that. I think it's very helpful framing. And I would also, what Gianleo said is, start early. So make sure you're embedding climate risk from the very beginning, thinking about sustainability and equity from the very beginning of policy and project preparation, because then you'll know that there are investors who are going to demand those things down the line. So I think those are the two pieces to keep in mind.
Thank you, Genevieve. Jean-Christophe, yeah, we are ending this session. I would like to make a plea, though, to all of you and all the actors listening to us that we do need to invest in that process in the local project preparation, capacity. We have been on there investing there because I think all these innovative solutions, all these mechanisms we have, they won't be used if we don't have people able to translate these big challenges into solutions that work for multiple benefits at the local level. So with that, we would like to close this session. Thank you very much to our panelists. It has been an amazing discussion. And we would like also invite all the people here to join our meeting with the PPP unit of Ukraine, which I think is going to take these challenges also to another level, but also maybe the right place to see how public-private collaboration can play a role. Jean-Christophe, any words from you?
Thank you. Let's move